Thank you, and apologies that I've just turned up. I got called to an urgent meeting on something else. So yeah, just a brief little bit about myself. So I'm Program Director for Health at the Alan Turing Institute. The Alan Turing Institute is the new National Institute for AI and Data Science. We have a footprint of about 200 researchers in the British Library. If you're ever around and want to pop in, it's a really nice space. We span about 13 of the leading universities across the UK. And the idea, and I think it's really working, is to pull together the UK's academic talent in mathematics, statistics, computer science, and information engineering to really drive forward algorithm development. Yeah? And so my role, which is co-funded by the HCI UK, is to try and tap into that talent base and get them focused on what I think are the interesting health problems. Yeah? And in particular, thinking about how we can develop, and building on the last talk, robust algorithms. Yeah? So algorithms that can work at scale, in the real world with the kind of messiness of health data. So that's a little bit about my kind of objective. So the overview of the talk, I think AI is, bandied around a lot. I'm going to kind of narrow it down and just say exactly what I mean by AI, and so then we can understand where I'm going with this. Explain why, we're absolutely in a hype cycle, but why we really do have potential for, AI, computational statistics, to be transformational for medicine, So, I come from statistics background, and, statisticians, we're the most kind of cautious breed of people out there. But I think there really is, demonstrable opportunities here. Going to characterize, again, at a very high level, the type of learning environments that benefit from the application of AI algorithms, and in particular, some areas which I think within the health sciences are kind of ripe for AI development. And then I'm going to delve down into a particular problem that I've been working in and developing algorithms for, again, just to give you an insight into kind of my world. And this is a case study from UK Biobank. So I'm sure that you're all aware of UK Biobank. And what we've been developing is algorithms within the UK Biobank for 100,000 individuals. They wore wrist-worn accelerometers. So you can think about these, they're not Fitbits, but think about them as Fitbits, yeah? And so for about 100,000 users, we have 2 weeks' worth of data of activity. But it's just raw signal. Yeah? So it just comes as a kind of a series of three-dimensional vectors, sampled at 100 hertz, so we have millions of data points per subject, and we're going to try and turn that into information about profiles, activity profiles, how much do they walk, how much do they sleep, etc. And then finally, I've just got a slide of where I think that there's really interesting technological challenges and opportunities for AI in the short term. And image analysis is really the poster child, and I'll say a little bit about that. Okay. So let's just kind of narrow down the definition, because AI is really kind of a broad field. And so what I'm going to, throughout the talk, when I say AI, I'm going to restrict my attention to computer systems that learn a task from example. Okay? So this was something kind of different to traditional computer programs where, a computer scientist would sit down and code an algorithm using if-then statements or if-then and-or kind of statements. So rather than actually kind of hand coding a classifier in terms of rules or explicit rules, you actually kind of write a wrapper algorithm and can just learn purely by example. So by repeated exposure to example, the system adapts itself to learn an optimal response. Yeah? And when you see it that way, you go, well, there's going to be some, real strengths and weaknesses of that approach. The strength is that you don't need somebody hand-coding the rules. Yeah? You just throw data at the algorithm. And the weakness is, of course, you don't have somebody actually developing the features. Yeah? So you're never quite sure what it's learned, unless you kind of restrict the model space. And so overarching areas of this definition of AI would include things like machine learning, but also computational statistics, as well as kind of inductive programming, probabilistic logic. Okay, why do I think that, yes, we're in a hype, but why do I think that it's, not say merited, but why I think this is a real phenomena? Yeah, and I don't think it's any coincidence that kind of AI arose after big data. You know, if you think about, well, you know, a few years ago, everyone was talking about big data. We can capture big data. Yeah. But, you know, AI is a kind of very natural follow-up for that. Because what did you do when you've kind of captured big data is you want to do something with it. Yeah? You want to turn that into knowledge, yeah, or into actionable intelligence. And so the two ingredients kind of came together. Yeah, and you need both of them. So one thing, for AI to work well, you need data at scale. And data, as we know, is just becoming cheap. Yeah, so increasingly, it's just cheap. It's cheap to measure things and capture and store data. And so we can just look at genetics and genomics. You know, the Human Genome Project took 10 years to do one genome. Yeah, now we can do thousands, you know, hundreds overnight. And that's also mirrored in other things like the new digital pathology hub, so capturing images at scale, health records, wearables. You know, a lot of people in this audience, I would suspect, will have Apple Watches or Fitbits. Yeah, so that's just kind of streaming data. And coupled to that, we also have investment in biobanks and longitudinal cohorts, which gives you very kind of high quality, relatively high quality data. So the two things that AI algorithms want is, one, access to data, large amounts of data. The more data, the better. And we're generating that now, like never before. I think the world's data storage doubles every 2 years or something. The other thing that you need is just raw compute power. Yeah, and particular things called graphical processing units. So these were originally to generate, were developed to use like video screens. Yeah, but now companies like NVIDIA, who develop the graphical processing units for screens like this one in front of me, they're driving these kind of deep learning and machine learning algorithms. So you put those two things together, AI are really compute hungry, and they want large amounts of data. And then again, connectivity across data environments. So I just wanted to point out that, the pointer. So the actual methods of AI, you know, when you read about deep learning, they haven't really changed that much. You know, if you picked up a paper on deep learning and you can imagine projecting it back 20, 30 years, it wouldn't be that surprising to a researcher working in the first wave of neural networks. They'd be able to read that. The fundamental structures haven't really changed. But what's changed is the ability to run them, yeah, rather than taking weeks to learn an algorithm, it can run in a few hours for training. And then operationally in a few seconds. But also this part here, yeah, in order to be able to kind of lock down the algorithm. Because again, because it's given free rein, you really need to kind of constrain it through data rather than hard coding. Okay, so, you know, to labour the point, what are the characteristics of learning systems where AI adds substantial value and robustness? So the first thing is you need large quantities of real-world data. The second thing, and this was mentioned before, is you need a stable learning environment. Yeah, so the more stable, as in, you know, the same scanner or the same measurement system. Yeah, any additional complexity in terms of demonstrating utility is going to lower that aspect. And the other thing is you really want to clearly define objective function. Classify this image into, is it of type A or type B? Yeah, and when you have those things together, then you have a real opportunity. And the other thing where it works well is where you have cryptic, kind of hard-to-define features. So, you know, biomarkers, you know, traditional biomarkers, do you need AI? Well, arguably. Yeah, I've yet to really read a paper where I think, wow, you know, that's really raised the bar in terms of, you know, careful measurements and then increased prediction. But where it really has raised the bar, things like deep learning, is image analysis. And that's no coincidence, because it's very hard to think of how would you handcraft, take an image from a pathology slide, how would you kind of handcraft the features that was able to distinguish, a particular subtype of disease. So we have lots of data. Handcrafted variables will be challenging or traditional, for statistical models to elicit. And the other thing is about integrating data modalities at scale. So how do we, when we start to combine images with genomes or genomes with electronic health records, again, that's where, you open up your traditional biostats book and there's nothing in there. Yeah, there's no recipes in traditional biostatistics that tells me how I can combine a genome with an electronic health record. Okay, so crudely speaking, given enough data, just use the raw compute power to build your models. Okay, so where I think there's particular opportunities in the space are, one, as I said, image analytics has been the kind of poster child for AI, and that's not surprising. The challenge now, as the previous speaker said, is really moving from the bench, from a very clean learning environment to the kind of bedside, to operationalizing that. And so how do you accommodate the real-world heterogeneity across sites? So, if you picked up an algorithm, that has been trained on high-quality images out of Oxford, and then put that algorithm into, say, a pathology lab in Belfast or Bristol, or vice versa, take one from Bristol and put it into Oxford, there'll be a degradation in performance, And we need to characterize what is that performance drop-off, okay? And how do we kind of mitigate that? The other area I think that there's really exciting work to be done is in improving the evidence base from clinical trials, So both in terms of streamlining recruitment, but equally around adaptive clinical trials. Can we kind of pull out more information about trial participants? And surrogate endpoints. If all your participants are wearing Fitbits, can we actually kind of use that information in there? Electronic health records, clearly. This is an interesting one we've been involved with, starting to involve with at the Turin, is actually on healthcare delivery. Actually operational research. So I had a really bizarre conversation at UCLH where my background was in statistical genetics, and they started talking about DNA and said, DNA is a real problem for us. And I was like, so I had about 20 seconds where I was trying to work out what was going on. Because for those of you that are laughing at me, obviously this does not attend. So what they were interested in is, can you identify the patients who don't turn up, for appointments? And then it's really nice, because if you can identify those, you can start to put interventions, text them the day before. And so actually I think healthcare delivery and operational research, scheduling appointments is going to be an important area where we see AI moving into. And the final area is this rise in the use of wearable devices. So consumer electronics, so streaming devices that just capture the way that we operate and move in our world. And in particular around aging population and monitoring well-being, I think this is a really exciting space. Again, because you just generate huge quantities of data as we move around our kind of digitalized, monitored world. Sounds a bit spooky, but there we go. So here's a study that we've been involved in involving UK Biobank. So as you are aware, UK Biobank is an incredibly rich resource, international resource, combining genetic information and various other lifestyle kind of pieces of information. There's going to be 100,000 brain images on there. We've got 100,000 body scans, got 500,000 genotypes sequenced genotyped at about 3 million markers. But in UK Biobank as well, on 100,000 individuals, we have wrist-worn, these kind of accelerometer data, And what we were interested in is saying, can we take that raw data? Can you use machine learning algorithms? Could we develop machine learning algorithms? Because there was nothing out there that might be able to go from that raw data to saying something about the activity patterns of this individual. How much do they sleep? How much do they walk? Etc. And then potentially link those into health outcomes. Do we see? Because self-reported activity we know is really poor. You ask someone, how much do you exercise? How much did you exercise last week? or how much did you sleep, or how much walking did you do? It's really hard, yeah? And we know it's biased upwards, yeah? You always say, well, I exercised a bit more than you did. And so the hope is actually using, kind of wearable devices, you get an unbiased estimate with higher resolution. When did you walk? Was walking in the morning? Does that have a slightly different impact to walking in the evening? Yeah. Now then you say, well, to answer that question, you need a lot of data. Well, yeah, we have a lot of data. We've got 100,000 individuals. Okay. So as part of this study, we have UK Biobank, 100,000 individuals but unlabeled. Yeah. But alongside that, we had something called the Oxford Capture 24. I should say this is being led by Aidan Doherty at the Big Data Institute in Oxford. I was really just providing the kind of machine learning advice. And on this, 150 people, mainly students, yeah, agreed not only to wear Fitbits, but actually cameras. Yeah? And so, yeah, I know, it's scary. So we had 150 people, yeah, for which we've got labeled data, because what happens if you have 150 students wearing cameras, you get another load of students to look at and label the data. Yeah? So for 150 students, we have not only the Fitbit data, but we actually have the handcrafted activity, yeah, what they were doing. So here's our machine learning task. We want to turn this small Oxford label data to learn a model that can scale up to 100,000 individuals across UK Biobank. And combining these two data sets, we're using, for the technical people out there, we do use this kind of deep generative models. It's kind of part of deep learning, but they're kind of fully probabilistic. And you need a probability model when you start to work with missing data, essentially. So we can think of this as missing data. We didn't know the activity, yeah? And so in order to do that coherently, you need a probability model. Yeah? And so this was our task. Okay, so sorry that I couldn't get the slide format to match up. So you're going to have a bit of white for a time. So this is joint work with Aidan Doherty at Oxford, the BDI, Big Data Institute, Matthew Willits, who's a PhD student of mine based at the Turing Institute. So we have on the right-hand side, this is the 150 people, 60,000 minutes of annotated data. Here's a little snapshot of what they were doing. Now, of course, it's going to be a heavily biased sample, yeah, because the activity of students in Oxford would be different than, UK population. On the right-hand side, we have 100,000 people with 7 days of annotated data. And what I want to do is have an algorithm that can go along and color this data stream according to what people were doing. Okay, and that's a raw signal. Yeah, and this is just, again, a bit glib, but just to highlight why you need a machine to do this rather than a statistician. Yeah, because this is just relates to, let me just check, 10 minutes worth of data for an individual, and we've got a week's worth of data on 100,000 individuals. And what you're seeing here, this is the raw signal that we're dealing with. Actually, it's one axis of the raw signal. And we're seeing a transition from somebody who's sitting here to walking. Yeah? And essentially, we want to be able to color, as I said, all of the things like that. And develop new algorithms to do that. Okay, so here's what we've got. Here's the labeled data, and again, it's like the Oxford bias. It's a bit. So here's the activity. Okay, yeah, they're rowing. Of course, actually, they're not rowing in Oxford. Looking at the sky there, I think they're on some training camp. So, but here's the Fitbit data that they're generating, and what happens is. We have students that look at that capture data and then label it according to what they were doing. Here they'd be rowing and then also walking, sleeping. They can turn the camera off, by the way. You'll be pleased to know. For all concerned. Yeah. And so here's the labeled data. This is the data that was labeled by the students. The white means they turned the camera off. And the blue is that we're detecting stuff, but we're sleeping. And so we can see a little red block there. This person was bicycling. we've got walk-in, whether they're in a vehicle. Yeah, and actually vehicles are quite hard for accelerometer data because it measures acceleration. And so if you're going at constant velocity in a car, yeah, it looks like you're sitting, and so it's a little bit of just subtlety that you kind of need to pick up. So that's the data that we've got. Yeah, we want to turn that, as I said, into new. And so when we develop these kind of machine learning algorithms, we are able to scale that up to UK Biobank at an accuracy, again, with like internal validation of about 90%, which is good, actually. It's about as good as a human can do. And that was tested on 130. So when we project that into the expected fashion or performance, the activity in 100,000, what you see is you do see, and then cluster the data, you do see distinct kind of behaviors. So we're able to kind of start to distinguish people, profiles of people, and cluster people about when they got up and when they went to sleep, those people that bicycle, those that don't. And you need, as I said, the data to really drive that level of resolution. Self-reporting isn't going to get you anything close to this level of and unbiasedness. So what are we looking at here? So what we've got here is really just to note that we get unbiased measurements, and then that, of course, gives you greater power to detect association. Yeah, because as we all know, the more noise you've got, the weaker the power. So having this resolution gives you greater power to detect associations. So applying that to UK Biobank, here's the distribution on the left-hand side of what the 100,000 people are kind of doing at various points during the day, according to. This is on a subset of the Oxford people. So we've got sitting and standing, obviously, at the main parts of the day, walking, in a vehicle, and mixed variable types, and then a tiny little bit of kind of bicycling at the top. When we look at smoking status, we see a big difference, or we see a significant difference between people that walk and smoke and people that don't smoke and walk, and maybe that's to be expected. And what else do we hear? The other thing we did, which was really interesting, is we took out, of course, and this is the multimodality part, is we've also got on UK Biobank, we've got all the genomes, genotypes. We've got 3 million impute into those markers, and then we're able to do a kind of genome-wide association study on activity patterns. Yeah, so we say, are there genetic markers in UK Biobank that seem to be driving people in sleep duration as well as sedentary behavior? And essentially, yes, but the signals are small, p-values are tiny because n is big, yeah? N's 100,000. So, predictively, don't see a huge amount, but you do see significant effects, and that's potentially interesting, especially when we start to think about opportunities around things like Mendelian randomization. I'm going to do kind of a little technical dive in here, which is one of the things that we had to deal with is that in many real-world data sets are only partially labeled. I think this is becoming increasingly apparent because we're in a world where data capture is cheap. Yeah, the labeled data where your clinicians will sit down and carefully annotate data, you're going to get a lot more of the unannotated data, just the found data that's out there. And so a consequence of that, in many real-world data sets, you only have partial labels. There's only a subset of your data is actually labeled or annotated. Say, if medical imaging annotation is expensive. And this falls into something called semi-supervised learning. The semi means, I've got some labels on some, but not on others. And what we want to do is to use the large amount of unlabeled data with a small amount of labeled data. So that's one of the things that we first looked at on that Oxford small data set combined with UK Biobank large amounts of data. And as I hinted at, you need a probabilistic model to drive that. What we're kind of currently working in, something we're calling semi-unsupervised learning, is what happens when you know that your labeled data doesn't contain all the examples. Yeah? So we know that there are certain activities you know, the Oxford student that we won't see within that 150 people within Oxford. Yeah, I think I said fishing, I don't know. But, you know, you could think of activities where UK population people would do, Oxford people wouldn't, like reading, maybe, my current students. Reading a book. No, sorry. But, you know, so Oxford data might not contain certain activities, whereas in the UK, wider population, you would. And so then this motivates a kind of a new paradigm that we've been trying to develop, or are developing, where you can try and discover latent classes in the data alongside learning small amounts or utilizing the small amounts of labeled data. So can we train classifiers to identify and recognize whole new classes, not only just the ones that have been annotated? Okay. And what we've done, if you're a machine learner, you would know all about these two data sets. These are hackneyed data sets that are used. So this is the MNIST data, which is of handwritten characters. And what we did is we kind of mask out. We said, oh, what would happen if you only saw the zeros and the fives? Yeah, I kind of identify that actually there's these other subgroups in the data, essentially. And on the right, we have a fashion MNIST. So you have pictures of shoes and jumpers. And say, what happens if you saw no shoes? Could you actually identify that? And the initial results are really promising. We say, yeah, actually we can. You know, using these new kind of deep learning, probabilistic things called variational autoencoders, we're able to detect classes that weren't labeled actually in our original data. Okay, so last slide. Just to kind of step back out, really, where do I think the kind of, say, technical promising areas, or as well as challenging areas? So one, deep learning. You know, everybody's talking about it, everybody's applying it, but what it needs, and I think, again, this echoes the previous speaker, is we really need critical evaluation and appreciation of when and where it works in the real world. Yeah, so a lot of the current documented evidence is from very clean data environments. Yeah, and also how can we take algorithms that have been trained in, say, the leading medical centers and deploy them? Yeah, and that enters into something called transfer learning. So can you kind of pick up an algorithm, yeah, and soften it slightly and retrain it in a different environment? I think causal inference is a really interesting area. So can we predict the effects of interventions? Data sharing, coping with missing data but under highly structured missingness. Study A might have genomes and electronic health records. Study B, just the electronic health records. How do you try and merge those objects? And finally, multi-view learning, which the previous speaker again touched upon. How do we combine data modalities at and across scales? Thank you.